Now, on today's Unpacked, we have a deep dive into the latest economic stats and what it means for our regional economy. We consider the ambitious plans for one of our airports that even involve connecting to the rail system. And we contrast the inability of government here to get things done with what happened 100 years ago on this island. And looking to China and the US for inspiration, we consider what's better, a government of engineers or a government of lawyers. Hello and welcome to Trading Up, the business podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
Professor of Practice at Queen's University School of Business, the business school there at Queen's University. Professor of Practice, Richard, that basically means that you actually do stuff. Is that the difference between you and other professors?
Well, it's you can either get professor from a academic research route, or you've been in industry, as it were. And I was 27 years as an economist in civil service and in the banking world.
In the banking world. You've got the scars to prove it, I know. Well, look, let me unpick some of the things and unpack some of the things we want to talk about today. So, the Northern Ireland economy. What's actually happening? I mean, essentially, you've been digesting all the latest stats and figures. Where should we start? Should we start with maybe, well, I suppose we're just after the summer. We've had the Open. We had the glory of the Open at Portrush there. All the world's players, all the talk of the impact, the amazing pictures of the place looking brilliant in the sunshine, and the benefit that we saw. I heard stories of people being charged 700 quid to get a taxi from Belfast to Portrush. So the taxi drivers were doing well. The hotels were doing well. The restaurants were doing well. We know about the stories about certain venues hiking their prices and doing particularly well. So was it boom time then for hospitality thanks to the Open? What do the figures tell us?
Well, what we saw in terms of hoteliers with the NISRA, the Northern Ireland Statistical Research Agency, their figures for June were, in terms of room sales, they were up 6% year on year, and it was the still not back to pre-COVID levels 2019, but it was the best year since then. However, what we did see in July, there's a bit of kind of mixed opinion as what happened in July, because on the one hand, hoteliers are saying, yes, it was really, really good, but the statistics that have come in through NISRA have then shown that there was actually a 10.5% year-on-year drop in July. And July is normally the biggest or the kind of best month for hotel occupancy, but hotel occupancy dropped 10 percentage points to just 65%. And that was the weakest July in 14 years. So whether it was the hoteliers were too busy to fill out the NISRA's hotel occupancy form to say how busy they were, so
it does seem it's counterintuitive, that, isn't it? You know, given the particular July we're talking about, that the figures would say that they've gone down. Now, is it a case of, and we were talking recently on the podcast about how we're beginning to question the accuracy of some statistical surveys, and how perhaps even being a statistician is a dangerous job if you come up with figures that people don't like. So we're not going to shoot the messenger here. Let's not play that game.
Yeah.
But, you know, can we rely on the figures, or do we rely on, you know, the anecdotes?
I suppose you're trying to get a picture of these kind of things. You try and put both together and then kind of form a view. Like, I had heard that there was a fall off in demand for, say, like golfers from the likes of the US, because Portrush wasn't open to be playing for the month of July. You know, that would have impacted there, but we'll maybe see in due course. But I think, you know, it's while the mercury pushed higher this summer in terms of the hot weather, it was also in terms of inflation and running costs, notably in terms of cost of labour and food prices. And so even though you're getting whether you do get a good occupancy rate, increasingly the problem facing the hospitality sector is profitability. Yeah, Record profitability is a totally different ballgame altogether.
Yeah, so even if you're getting the numbers in through the door, that's great. You might even be charging, you know, more than before, but if your input costs have been going up so much, the costs of your food effectively or other costs that you have, then you're not making as much money, and you really aren't perhaps doing as well. Now, looking at the figures, then you talk about sort of perhaps the highest number since the COVID-19 pandemic was what we saw in June, all right? But the sector had been optimistic that 2025 overall could surpass the record-breaking year of 2019, which was just before the pandemic. And we suppose because of the big damage that the pandemic made to the normal way of working in the economy, we keep sort of looking back at stats to see, have we gone back to pre-pandemic levels? So what about that? What are the chances of tourism breaking the 2019 record?
So we'll have to see then how August figures fare and whether there's a kind of rebound there. But I think it could be close. And but getting back to record levels of occupancy, as I said, is kind of one thing. It's the profitability is going to be the problem, and the hospitality sector has experienced what you would call a hospital pass, which in rugby or football terms is when you get thrown a pass, and the moment you get it, you're kind of set upon by a number of tacklers.
You're off to hospital.
And normally, yes, you end up sort of on your back and off to hospital. And in many ways, the hospitality sector has experienced, while we had all these positives in terms of hosting the Open, great weather, all of that, Rachel Reeves and her increase to national insurance contributions for employers has kind of really impacted. It's impacted a number of sectors, but particularly in the hospitality sector. Allied to that is then the 6.7% increase in national living wage. And if you look at then even how the national living wage has increased by close to 50% since 2019, the pre-COVID year, and it's almost doubled for 16 to 18 age group, which is a cohort which the hospitality sector, amongst other areas such as retail, will kind of draw on that. So huge cost pressures. And I suppose for that, if they just had that would be bad enough. But then what we're now seeing is then food price inflation, and that seems to be what everybody's talking about, that the water coolers or at weekends is how much they paid for certain food items.
Yeah. I mean, food, let's get into that in a minute. But I suppose just thinking about the hospitality sector and employment, so that's a sort of double whammy. We've got the national living wage increasing by 6.7% year on year. We've got a 50% increase since 2019. We've got the younger cohort, 16 to 18-year-olds, where it's almost doubled, as you say. That's a huge cost pressure. And I'm not seeing or hearing about 16-year-olds going around with their kind of pockets stuffed with cash. So I'm assuming, therefore, the knock-on effect of this is that perhaps they're employing fewer, or they're employing them for fewer hours. So that isn't necessarily a positive all round. But I mean, if you look at other industries where they're facing these pressures, let's say retail, one of the solutions is automation. So anybody knows, you go into Tesco or Sainsbury's these days, you get to the till and it's a machine, you do it yourself. And there's maybe one staff member there to help you out whenever the thing can't tell you whether your bag is in the packing area or not, and before you start cursing too much, they come over and help you out. But that's one person versus maybe 20 machines. Hospitality, there's elements of that, I suppose. You go into some, kind of more budget hotels these days, you might have to check yourself in at a machine. But hospitality, you do expect to see a friendly face, don't you?
Yeah, and then particularly in terms of then, if you're then going up in terms of the standard or the quality of hospitality, certainly you're not going to go into like a 5-star hotel or a 4-star hotel and be greeted by a kind of keypad or something to then just check in and stuff. Well, that may be an option and for some people, but it's going to be, there's going to have to be people, and it is relatively labour intensive.
Yeah, I mean, you get this thing now, and I heard somebody else giving off about this, and I got where they were coming from. And this happens in hotels that aren't necessarily, shall we say, the absolute budget hotels. But you get, the way used to get the little card in the hotel bathroom and say, we're environmentally conscious, please, if you don't want us to constantly wash all your tiles, hang them up.
Good cover story.
Exactly. Because obviously what they're doing is they're saving money by not having to wash the tiles, and fair enough. And you shouldn't, throw a tile in the wash after just, drying yourself once or whatever it is. But then you get the next stage of that now. Sometimes when you check in and the hotel desk, they say, no, we're environmentally conscious and therefore we don't like to clean your room unless we have to. So if you're staying for a few days in one place, tell us whether you really want us to bother coming and causing all this environmental damage to clean your room, which it seems to me is an absolute cover story for we don't have the staff anymore to actually clean your room. And one of the treats of staying in a hotel surely is the fact that somebody else comes in and you have a lovely clean room to come back to at the end of the day. So yeah, we're seeing these kind of little cheats, but it's not necessarily making the customer experience any better. And if you're going to do it properly, bottom line is in that sector, you're going to need to employ people.
But then what hotels are doing is that they're then looking at then how they design their rooms to require the least amount of cleaning and to be cleaned as quickly as possible. And they're then just trying to focus on, and it's almost like, it's a bit like doing kind of what the budget airlines do. They then try and look at stripping it down to what is it that people staying in a hotel overnight would value the most, and it would be the likes of maybe the how comfortable the bed is in terms of the mattress. So that's where they would spend the money and less on the other areas and the sort of cleaning and whether there has to be necessarily be food there and things like that. But
yeah. No, I mean, I get all of that, and I've stayed in the, some hotel chains, and you have to be careful about this one, going over to work in London. Quite often, and I've booked, try and get the cheapest rate possible in certain hotel chain, knowing that there will be a basic standard, a decent, comfortable bed. That's kind of all you want, and a decent, clean bathroom. But what I didn't realise, what you had to specify on the website as to whether or not you wanted windows in your bedroom.
or in aisles.
Windows kind of were almost like a basic, I thought, that came with the usual offer, but apparently not in London these days. You can be stuck in some hellhole of a basement, or it's a bit like being in the middle of a boat where you don't have windows in the room. So yeah, look out for
I have seen automated cleaning though. It was actually in a hotel in Berlin where it was the old Hoovers, the automatic Hoovers, just going round and doing all the
corridors and so on. Yeah. Well, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, that's the pressure on the hospitality sector. But let's talk about one of the other things which is affecting hospitality and others. As you say, people are almost talking about it at dinner parties because dinner parties are getting so much more expensive these days. I understand, thanks to food inflation. So food prices, they're up 4.8% year on year in August, the fastest rate in 18 months, building on a 37% increase over the last 4 years. And this is with sort of inflation itself flatlining, but food inflation, when I say inflation's flatlining, still it's the same rate. In other words, prices are still going up much higher than they should be, but food inflation's going up more. So what's causing that?
Kind of a variety of things. One of the reasons why food is going up is we were talking about the national living wage and wage increases. So that is fed through to, if you think of then food producers and the costs there. So that feeds through in terms of that. But also when we have there's those kind of domestic factors, but there's also then the international factors and then climate. So we all know about climate change and the extreme weather, and so we've got. So if we look at some of the areas which have seen the strongest rises, or if you look at the likes of coffee and chocolate, maybe 2 of your 5 a day.
Yeah,
and you just got coffee is up 15% year on year in August, chocolate up 15%. But when you look at over the last 4 years, coffee's up 43% and chocolate's up 50%. And the reasons behind that are in terms of the likes of Brazil, which is a key coffee producer. It's had a drought, damaged the crop, and then that has implications in terms of costs there. Similarly, in terms of chocolate, I didn't realise that the Ivory Coast is one of the top producers for cocoa and chocolate prices, and the fact that it had rain unseasonal kind of rain, which damaged the crop and has led to various diseases. And the upshot of that is that chocolate prices have gone through the roof. But it's not just that; it's even the likes of beef is up 25% year on year, and the likes of butter 19%, even milk is up almost 13% year on year. So all these prices are, just adding to, and particularly things like the idea of like going out for a coffee or at the end of a meal or having a second coffee is, given the prices, it's people are going to give it a bit more thought.
You begin to notice it, absolutely. So things like, say, the beef and milk, butter, we think of these as homegrown, but their input costs are going up. So therefore, the price of actually, raising that cow, producing the beef is going up in different ways.
Yeah, and it's even in terms of if you even think the fact that the better weather, sunnier weather, then means that the grass, or we haven't had the rain, the grass hasn't grown to the same degree, so they haven't been able to feed off the grass, so they've had to have additional feed, additional costs. That all sort of adds up, and the likes of ultimately beef, cattle, and dairy are priced on international sort of commodity markets. So it's then whatever's happening to the world price, even though we're determines things there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember looking at the economics, for instance, not beef but chicken, for instance, a huge chicken producers here in Northern Ireland. We obviously eat a lot of chicken here, but also export a lot of chicken. And I remember going past the docks one day and seeing the grain sort of stacked up at the side of the docks, and I was maybe asking somebody down there who knew about it what that was for, and they said, well, it's largely that will be going off to to feed the chickens. So the economics of it were kind of interesting because we import all the feed for the chickens, and then we grow the chickens. But also, certainly at that time, and maybe still to a certain extent, import a lot of the labour to help raise the chickens. And then we sort of, as I say, export the chickens. And as they were sort of pointing out, it was our kind of carbs to protein kind of machine where the carbs came in the form of the grain and disappeared in the form of protein. But naturally, we're not really set up for that kind of production because we are having to import both the raw material, as in the grain, and perhaps even the labour as well.
Yeah, whereas in the likes of the US, it would then have soya beans are the big thing, and in terms of one of the big exports from US to the likes of China, where they've got their feedstuffs where they can give it to their pigs and cattle and whatnot.
Yeah, and they can grow it on a large scale, whereas we, for a lot of feed for our agricultural sector, we have to import it. We don't have the capacity to grow it here in any large amounts. So looking ahead then, what are we looking at in terms of, the input costs that all of these industries are facing? We're talking about food there. We've talked about the increase in labour costs. Are there any others that are kind of producers and manufacturers have to think about now? Any other kind of costs that are weighing down on them?
Well, it's there's, in terms of packaging, food packaging, there's a introduction of what is called the EPR, or the Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme. So that's adding a further cost to food producers. So they now have to deal with the waste management of the various packaging. Rather than that being dealt with from local governments, that cost is being passed on to food producers. So that's going to lead to further increase in prices. And because firms in the food and, by extension, hospitality sector will be disproportionately impacted by that, that's going to be a cost. And I think it's October will be the first invoices. So next month, those first invoices will be coming through, and that is going to add a cost
onto those producers.
Yep.
So the idea being there, so currently, we all know we have to fill our recycling bin. And sometimes, to be honest, I do think like so much food that you buy, it does come in an awful lot of packaging because you notice how much there is when you're trying to sort it out and you're putting it into the recycling bin. So this is a way of trying to shift the burden of that to some extent onto the producers. Therefore, not just us as domestic customers and then the council who collects your waste, but then the producers have to try and deal with it more, or at least pay for it more. And if they have to pay for it, the idea being that they'll reduce the amount that they're creating. So are we likely to see then lots of new packaging coming to the fore as they try and reduce the footprint on that?
Yeah, we probably will, and that is going to be whether it's then kind of like scaled back and more recyclable kind of packaging, or which even packaging that we're able to put into the appropriate bins as well, and not all the actual kind of like the single-use plastic.
Yeah, so it'll be a bit of a change on that, but that is an extra cost. So they're all being squeezed on these kind of things. We're seeing kind of rising costs. There's the business costs, with businesses struggling to maintain profitability because they're seeing, I suppose, input costs like labour and food soar. We're seeing, and on the other hand, though, are we seeing how that's feeding through into the consumer? So if I'm a producer, I'm making stuff, it's costing me more to produce this stuff, but I can maybe do okay, maintain some form of profitability if people are still buying my stuff. But what are we seeing in terms of the consumer? How kind of robust is consumer spending?
Well, in terms of the consumer, we had figures out last week, which was then looking at retail sales it was for the 3 months to the end of June, which was showing retail sales quite strong. So consumer holding up, although that's always kind of distorted, where we've got one of the most buoyant consumers south of the border, which is able to come up, and we get the kind of the tailwind, and retailers get the boost from down south as well. But it's worth bearing in mind whenever you think of, if the price of our kind of necessities like food go up, that means we have less money to spend on discretionary areas, whether that's retail or going out to hospitality, availing of that, going on holidays, etc. And in Northern Ireland, food accounts for almost 1 in every £7 of household expenditure. In the UK, it's only 1 in 9. So that's a significant amount. So then if you're a retailer, or if you're a business which is reliant on consumer spending, you will be concerned that the consumer, just because the costs of their necessities are going up, they're going to their behaviour is likely to change. So whether you hear of people who are then maybe not going out and maybe trying to get something nice from the likes of M&S or other stores are available in terms of for dinners and meals, and they do it that way, or they're just then changing how they shop and dropping down, sort of downshifting to a cheaper brand, and those are all the things which are going to be happening at the minute.
Yeah, so a bit of a squeeze, and I suppose nervous, perhaps then if you were in the hospitality sector or in a food producing business where people are going to be squeezed. Well, I know you were at a briefing. Tell us about this sort of upshot of all of things for Northern Ireland in terms of how public spending is going to go. I know we've got the budget coming up at the end of November. We've got Northern Ireland will have to respond to that and how it kind of sets forth spending plans, etc. There are a lot of cost pressures, we know, in key parts of the public sector. So what's the sort of readout? What are you picking up from our kind of civil servants at Stormont, and where they think things are going to go over the next few while?
Well, the kind of general view amongst economists was that the spending review that we had was relatively generous, and that was going to keep us in a reasonably good position for the next 12 months or so. But again, you've got the likes of problems with inflation. But I was actually at a pretty sobering presentation by the Permanent Secretary of Department of Finance yesterday, Neil Gibson, where there was a load of economists and business people at it, and he was just kind of setting out where things are. And I suppose it was, I'm not known for my optimism at the best of times, but it was gloomier than I had sort of thought.
And to be fair to, like, Neil Gibson, people might remember when he was maybe more publicly prominent. He came from the private sector. He worked in academia as well before joining the government here as the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Finance. And he himself would often, have tried to sort of not so much put a positive gloss on things, but maybe see the positive, the silver lining in things.
Yep.
So you're telling me now, as the guy in charge of the finances, the public sector finances here, he's a bit weighed down by what's facing it.
Yes, because primarily, so we're going into, even before we hit the budget on the 26th of November, there's already several hundred millions of pounds worth of additional spending pressures facing Stormont. So that's from a variety of areas, from pay claims for like the likes of Department of Health. There's going to have to be money found for the PSNI, the data breach, which is going to cost over 100 million, and various pressures. You're getting up to several hundred million, and then that obviously sounds a lot of money, but some people may think, oh, but in the grand scheme of things with government finances, that would be easily sorted. And essentially, kind of up until now, we always had this belief that yes, even though there were challenges and there were pressures, you could then kind of close the gap, or there would be money coming and you would get Barnett consequentials from various budgets. And that would then get you over a hump and then get you sorted out for another year or whatever. But Northern Ireland's due to then has to budget for a multi-year budget. So that's going to come in December. So I suspect Minister John O'Dowd's going to be maybe the Grinch that stole Christmas when it comes to unveiling that sort of budget. And it's going to be very difficult to how you're going to deliver a budget knowing that there's these spending pressures. And given the way the fiscal outlook is in the UK, there's no sign, even the most optimistic person would know that there are going to be these challenges. How are you going to deal with them? And, talk about several hundred million. How could you raise 100 million? To raise 100 million, you'd have to increase both the domestic and non-domestic, that's the business rates, by 6%. 1% increase in public sector pay would be 100 million. Or if it's in health, it's like 53 million. So those things are, those costs are difficult, and it's going to be essentially, we're not in the position of looking for efficiencies and belt tightening. We're going to have to be looking at, and it sounds as if maybe like a broken record and said this before, but in terms of deprioritizing things, stop doing activity and raising revenue. And we know that's been something that Stormont Executive has been very reluctant to do.
Not keen on. Let's spell that out clearly. What you're talking about there is cuts and tax rises of some sort. Local tax rises essentially would be rates or water charges, which they've constantly shied away from. And cuts would be, as you say, we're not doing this.
But it's increasingly going to get to, we're in this kind of fiscal rut. Like it may not be austerity, but we're in this fiscal rut where it is pretty, in terms of the public finances, it will be a pretty miserable existence. And in order to deliver pay increases, because remember, that's where inflation kicks in, and then public sector workers, like other workers, won't want to see their pay eroded with inflation. But because inflation is so high, it's going to be very difficult to give those pay rises. And then, given that the budget constraints, they're going to have to be then looking at how do they, if they are to give those pay rises, there's going to be they're going to have to look for efficiencies, reducing headcount, delivering things in different ways, all of those kind of things. So, and as far as I can see, that's kind of where we're at. And I note that there's advertisements for permanent secretary posts and in the civil service.
Are you going to apply?
No. And I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for people in the public sector to deliver what the electorate expects, given the budgets and the constraints that they've got. Normally it was, you could go to Westminster, try and argue for more money, but that's not an option now. One of the areas, I suppose, is whether we get into areas such as like the housing executive looking for borrowing powers. We go and focus on things like that. That would be better. We could get something there, but the public finances looking ahead are going to be extremely challenging, and it's not something this isn't something. We're in this. One of the biggest problems is because economic growth is so low. So when you've got growth of like 1 to 1.5%, and you've got inflation at close to 4%.
Yeah. You need to really boost the growth somehow, and that's the huge challenge. Nobody's cracked that in Western Western world at the moment. But let me sort of jump then into something else. Let's talk. Let's try and be a bit more positive, Richard. People who listen to this podcast are mostly in business, and they're, I suppose, doing business, running a business, is an act of kind of positivism in itself, because you do have to face all of these headwinds, whether it be the kind of broader economic scenario, or what's happening with public spending, or how it impacts on you in terms of the costs and regulations that you face. So let's look at a private sector initiative. I was at the launch last week at Stormont of Belfast City Airport's 15-year master plan, and I think why I wanted to talk about this is it's one of our key pieces of infrastructure here. We've got the 3 airports, 2 in Belfast area, 1 in Derry, and the city airport, of course, is very well connected with business, and so what happens to it is kind of really interesting, how that might impact on the wider economy. But just to sort of headline a couple of the things that came out of their plans over the next 15 years, what they'd like to do. Well, they'd like to invest around 200 million of private investment. Now, it would be unlocked. That's the word that's used quite often in these things. Unlocked if the right sort of things happen. Some of those require government decisions. But what that would mean, if it all happens, is that there would be double the on-site workforce, so another 1,100 jobs created. Beyond the airport itself, the plan would support 23,000 jobs. The economic contribution for the master plan would deliver 1.7 billion in economic activity in the GVA annually to the Northern Ireland economy, doubling its current contribution. You'd have big passenger growth, but they say that they'll do that by having sort of bigger, more efficient planes. And one of the key things that they've said they want to do is create a new airport rail link. Now, this is basically where you'd be able to come out of the airport, walk across a nice covered walkway, and join a new railway halt/station from Belfast City Airport that would take you straight into Belfast's new Grand Central Station, or on to wherever you want to go after that. And I suppose that's the eye-catching bit, having this new railway station. But let's just reflect on what's there at the moment.
At least you would then you'd be able to be dropped off at the central station, whereas if you went by a taxi or car, you wouldn't.
Yeah, well, let's talk about, there's problems with the current scenario around Belfast Grand Central, absolutely. But we've all seen people sort of wonder, sometimes they're driving down the Sydenham bypass, have they come towards the kind of the border between the US and Mexico, as you see, hapless souls, dodging the traffic with little kind of rucksacks and so on. And you think, where did they come from? But they've actually probably somehow scaled a few fences and come from the Sydenham rail halt and tried to find the way into the airport.
Google Maps has been playing up on this.
Yeah. Somebody has thought, perhaps, with some justification, they've used, I don't know, as you say, Google Maps, any other city, railway station, airport. Oh, right, that's beside the airport. I'll go there. And then they discovered that it's a treacherous trek. Anyway, the point is the railway halt is very close to the airport. It's just not connected to it. So they want to do that. It doesn't seem like it's going to be that difficult to do. Throw a new bridge across, build a new station. But that's when you sort of take an intake of breath and you wonder, will it happen? Because it requires planning. It requires TransLink to, have the budget to do its bit. It requires everybody to say, let's do this and let's do it on time. And then you think maybe 15 years is a bit optimistic. This is the problem with these things, is that we have some good ideas, we have some great plans, but getting them delivered seems to be the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, past experience would sort of say therein lies the problem, and we've got a number of projects such as the York Street interchange. Again, it was judicial reviewed, and it's never got started. So there's a lot of things like that. We have good ideas, but it's getting them through and delivered seems to be a perennial problem for us here.
Yeah, and I think that's where people maybe get a little bit weary. I thought what was interesting at the launch of this master plan, which happened at Stormont in the Long Gallery, there was good representation there from the politicians. Politicians from the area, MP Gavin Robinson, DUP leader, with the First and Deputy First Ministers were there, and a very good cross-section of business leaders and so on who were interested to hear what was going to be happening. But I thought it was interesting, there was a point raised by Angela McGowan, CBI, and Angela said a few words about how important this would be for the Northern Ireland economy. But she referred back to a scheme that I, frankly, had never really sort of thought about before, which was the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, which was completed in 1929. And that was under the authority of the old Irish Free State, which, if people know their history, came into being in 1922. So within 7 years of the formation of the Free State, they had built this hydroelectric scheme, which at the time cost effectively 20% of the GDP of the country. It was constructed by the German company Siemens with a workforce of about 5,000 Irish labourers. And it was one of the largest engineering projects of its era in the world. I mean, and the funny thing is, I suppose people listening to this, and certainly I was more aware of the Hoover Dam in America. It was seen as one of those big Depression era projects in the US, a remarkable feat of engineering. We've all seen pictures of it, maybe even flown over it. But the Shannon hydroelectric scheme came before it in a country that was practically bankrupt. And yet the politicians decided they had to do this, and they got it done in a pretty good space of time. And by 1935, it was generating 80% of Ireland's electricity, an engineering milestone of the 20th century, according to basically, the world's engineers. That's how they see it, okay? So that's the Shannon hydroelectric scheme. That's what was happening in 1929. And today in Northern Ireland, we worry whether they'll be able to build a bridge across the Sydenham bypass, or whether they'll be able to pedestrianise a street in Belfast Cathedral Quarter, or indeed whether they'll be able to do something bigger, such as the A5 road project, which has been held up forevermore. And I suppose the point that maybe Angela McGowan was making there to the politicians was, people really do want to see some action. And yes, we understand that certain things, let's say the A5, where they're trying to get it done, is being held up because of, court action. But other things are held up, it seems, just because the computer says no. That seems to be almost the default sometimes in government here, whether that's any one person or just the way the system seems to work. Any thoughts on that?
I suppose probably planning and delivery was more streamlined back in those days, and it was probably in an era before the NIMBY, or Not in My Backyard, was kind of born. And I suppose that's when we look at both in terms of in Northern Ireland, in terms of getting or getting key bits of infrastructure done, there always seems to be then complaints and people against it, and we've got issues with the North-South interconnector again. That can't seem to be. So really good ideas and essential infrastructure cannot get delivered because of political objections. That's also a feature in the South, particularly in terms of housing. And and we've seen there recently, or this week then, about Gatwick's going to be getting its second runway, and again that's something which has been objected, and clearly Keir Starmer's trying to get some things moving where they have to get some kind of projects and infrastructure off the ground if they're going to get economic growth. So it
is that problem, yeah. And I mean, interestingly about the airport is, do you remember the whole debate about whether or not the airport runway at Belfast City should be lengthened? It was, of course, a huge debate. Michael O'Leary played his part in that, and he effectively insisted upon it. I see he's having a big row with is it one of the Spanish airport authorities at the moment, and pulling planes out of Spain because he doesn't like how they're treating him. But okay, so Michael O'Leary has his own opinions, and he's fully entitled to them. He wanted Belfast's airport runway to be longer so he could fly certain planes in and more often. They weren't able to get the planning for it. It was hugely controversial, and he upped and went away He'd previously
It
been
was also heavily lobbied against. From
Yes, yeah.
the residents.
The residents of Sydenham and Coltra weren't too pleased about the ideas of the planes, bigger planes coming in.
Sydenham were probably okay. It was probably Cultural.
Maybe they had more clout. But here's the thing: the new plans for the city airport don't involve lengthening the runway. They might involve, as I say, it'll involve more passengers certainly. But what they're saying is they can do that with bigger, better planes, and maybe they might need to stretch the kind of time frame, the window during which planes can land and so on, because they're just so scared about the idea, presumably, of having to go down the whole planning process again.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where they're trying their best to avoid planning because it can become such a problem. So I think that's kind of instructive. It tells you something about where people see the blockages here today. But does that mean that we shouldn't try anything just because it might become too complicated? That's kind of my worry when we look at these things, that if the politicians maybe don't see the impact of this, the sort of longer term impact of this is that you get to a scenario where people believe politics is incapable of doing, stuff that's required, and therefore they just try and work around it and live with the existing scenarios where other countries who can get things done move ahead.
Yep, and it's short-termism has been the kind of problem which has been hitting governments around the world, and I suppose in Northern Ireland we've had that for quite some time. And I suppose politically, there's whenever something takes a long time, it takes longer than the electoral cycle to bear fruit. Politicians are maybe sort of thinking they're more reticent about going down that route, but that's one of the problems where we've now got populist kind of politics is sweeping across Europe, US, and to a degree in the UK, that electorates want things done now. So it's getting the populist politician has to deliver things now. And how do you do that if you've got long-term investment projects? And that means you're going to have to then look at how can you turbocharge planning, your infrastructure planning. We've been successful in Belfast in the past. The likes of the Lagan side has been, is held up as an exemplar of best practice around Europe in terms of developing the waterfront area. That's kind of been forgotten about, and maybe we have to then try and start looking at why were we successful there? How did that come about? And how can we replicate it and roll it out elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, Laganside was a development corporation that was set up with a specific purpose. Back in the 80s, the objective was to, as you say, develop the waterfront property along the River Lagan through Belfast city centre and on out. So I think it stretched maybe from the likes of the gasworks right through down to sort of Clarendon Dock. And it was seen actually, as very successful because the corporation was sort of democratically mandated. Obviously, this is in the era before devolution, but people were appointed by politicians. The body itself was given power, but it was given that power by elected politicians, and therefore it was told, go and do this job, and when you're finished this job, you will not be needed anymore. And sure enough, that was the case. The interesting thing, it's funny that you mention it, because I understand that there is a discussion going on sort of behind the scenes at the moment with various interested parties, business and politics, are looking at this again because I think they do recognise, I think there is a general recognition, and this is to be fair to the politicians, I've picked this up, that they know we have a certain system of government here which can make things difficult, but they know that the reason that the system of government is there is because of our need for coalition government, because of the primacy of, if you like, peace and community cohesion. It's not about effective kind of delivery of policy. So how do they get around this? Well, there is a suggestion that you could sort of re-energise the whole sort of Laganside idea, come back with another development corporation, but perhaps not necessarily, obviously the Laganside bit's been done, but perhaps there's, an area, say Belfast or Belfast city centre, that could be defined as requiring this intervention. You could devolve power from It would be presumably some of the government departments, maybe the likes of Belfast City Council, the key planning powers, the infrastructure powers, some of the community powers that are needed. And then you would say, off you go. You've got maybe 5 years to do X, Y, and Z. You would democratically sort of mandate this new body to get on with it. It might even be able to draw down funds from central government, which are going to other cities across the UK now under different schemes, because at least then central government know, well, if they give you this money, we know it's going to be spent properly. And then if it achieves its goals, great. And if it needs an extension, great. But it's sort of time limited and get on with things. And, that would be interesting to see. It'd be refreshing to see if somebody did come up with something like that to actually move the dial a little bit here.
Yeah, and when I was highlighting the kind of challenges with the public finances, it's economic growth is what we need to improve both here and the UK. If we could import some of that economic growth from the south, that would be great. But we haven't the time to then be the kind of wasted time and resources and the whole opportunity cost when you think of when plans are judicial reviewed, and Northern Ireland's got the reputation of being the judicial review capital of the UK. We don't have that time, and we have to then start progressing on things. That doesn't mean that you don't wire off all the kind of like environmental issues and all of those kind of things, but we just have to move a lot faster. We have to streamline things. We have to prioritize things. And if there's any blockages or obstacles, how do we navigate our way through them?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the problem is if we don't find ways to do things effectively like this with the various checks and balances that are required, as you say, I mean, you can't ignore the environment. And no doubt if you were doing the Shannon hydroelectric scheme today, there would be a much bigger consideration as to the environmental impact of something like that. But if you continue unable to do stuff, then you end up with a sort of Elon Musk Doge scenario where people support the idea of literally going in and getting rid of key government departments, which are doing good stuff because they're so sick of what they see as kind of government inaction.
Yeah, and then it's even from the government departments' perspective as well. People want to feel as if they're achieving something and they're delivering things, and I suppose it's maybe there's a risk culture, and then the spectre of a public accounts committee or PAC if something goes wrong, and the scars of RHI scandal and all of those kind of things, that people are reticent to do that. But we have to look at how do you facilitate getting the right people, the right processes, the right institutions in order to turbocharge and be able to deliver these much needed economic growth projects in a timely manner.
I know you were you've got a new book you were showing me earlier. I must actually try and get a copy of it, which is interesting when we're talking about this as to who's better at doing things. So let's go sort of global again for a minute. When we think about the two big kind of superpowers in the world now, it's US and China. That's the kind of the global balance between these two systems. And when we think about it, where things are done swiftly and efficiently, whether, maybe there are considerations, human rights, environment and so on, that don't get as much of a look in. China seems to be winning that race. So tell us about this book and kind of the analysis.
Yeah, the book, so it's kind of doing the rounds. This guy, Dan Wang, Canadian, who spent time, he's got Chinese parents, and he was over in China during one of the lockdowns and was there for 3 years, and then
started lockdown.
Quite a lockdown indeed. And so he ended up writing these letters and describing what was going on, and his book, and he's become the kind of go-to person on talking about China. He's on various podcasts, Freakonomics One, Odd Lots, and his book is China's Quest to Engineer the Future. It's breakneck, and and I suppose it's then he just then documents even in some of the podcasts his travels and how he sees even in some of the poorest parts of China where they have excellent infrastructure, and whether it's viewed as bridges to nowhere, but the optimism, and they're built with a view that bridges to nowhere could become a bridge to somewhere in the future. And I suppose what he highlights is then it's the engineering pedigree of the Communist Party, and that was basically Deng Xiaoping was basically then, whenever he started then packing the sort of government and the political party with engineers, and that's, I think it was then even in the early 2000s, there was like all of the Politburo, the key positions, they were all had engineers, whether civil engineers. I think even President Xi, I think he's chemical engineering kind of background.
So they all have this kind of engineering, scientific
build stuff, make things.
And that's their approach. And whereas in the US, which is what we're comparing it with, even we think back to the founding fathers, they were lawyers, and lawyers are useful, but they like to argue one point and another point, and maybe that, as he's suggesting, there's a problem then that you have all these lawyers in the States who have a very legal system. Let's not sort of question what's happening to that legal system at the moment, but you have a legal system where people like to argue about the rights and wrongs, what should be happening, whereas the Chinese system is much more about this is what we can do and get on with
they can get on with it. And I suppose then where there's no democracy, they would have their views of a plan, and this is what we want to achieve. Whereas I suppose one of the issues, the challenges in the US is in terms of the infrastructure, where it did have good engineering prowess, and you think of Eisenhower with all the interstate roads that have freeways and stuff that he had sort of developed, but then they've got a lot of their airports, a lot of their electrical kind of infrastructure, energy infrastructure is kind of poor, and they've kind of moved more towards the lawyer side than the engineering side.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the downsides of democracy, if you like, is its inefficiency, because you are going to necessarily slow things down by arguing as to whether or not they really are in the people's interest.
And then in terms of then it's. Dan Wang sort of develops the argument, and then it's then the kind of very wealthy, they can then they can get lawyers and they can block progress, or they can block developments in certain areas, which clearly isn't an issue in the likes of China.
So interest groups, and let's face it, we look at justice and law. And, justice is blind, famously, with the little sort of statue of justice with her blindfold on and her scales, which is our ideal of justice. But in reality, when we're talking about civil litigation, rich people have more access to it. Rich interest groups can argue their case with more lawyers, and therefore can block things. So is there a way then, if you're looking at Dan Wang's kind of analysis, that you have the kind of engineering state of China versus the lawyerly state of the US, is there a way of kind of coming up with the best of both worlds, where you have kind of good planning and efficiency, but still the democratic checks that you might require?
I suppose that's the challenge, and that kind of hybrid model is probably what people would want to go for, but but I think certainly Northern Ireland, we'd want to take a leaf out of the kind of engineering book of what China can do in terms of how to, everything's on a spectrum where you can have totally blocking something, or developing projects which, you throw environmental concerns, human rights concerns and everything like that out the window. Nobody wants that either, but it's how probably China and the West has to then try and move towards the other. But we certainly need to have more of a kind of engineering can-do culture developed here.
All right, it's a fascinating little thought. Maybe we can develop this. Maybe we should have a kind of seminar someday. Bring some other thinkers into the room. See if we can come up with that hybrid model to basically turbocharge our economic engine here in Northern Ireland. Richard, listen, thanks a million for joining us today on Trading Up Unpacked, which is produced in association with EY. So join us again next time.